YouTube. My name is Jack, and I am outside because it is a beautiful day today. Also, my bedroom is a mess, and it seemed easier to film out here. Sorry the sunlight is very harsh. I realize my face is deeply shadowed, but it's just nice out, and I'm wearing shorts, and I wanted to be out in the sun. Today, we're gonna sort of talk around what makes a tarot deck generally and what makes a good tarot deck more specifically. This is something I've been thinking about quite a lot lately, um, because there were so many tarot decks. There were so many, hundreds upon hundreds of tarot decks. And as a tarot person, as someone who reads a lot, who collects decks, who keeps pace with new decks that are coming on the market, even if I'm not buying them, there comes a point where the decks kind of all start to blend together. At this point, I have 60 odd tarot decks, and I don't really buy that many new ones because it takes a lot for me to sit up and notice with a new tarot deck. There comes a point where I'm like, yep, that's another Rider-Waite-Smith clone, and it's beautiful, and the artwork is lovely, but it's not seizing me and holding my interest, and it's not something that really makes me take notice. And so I've been thinking about what does make for a really exciting tarot deck. What does make for something good and new? Um, and obviously, like the clear answer here is that a good tarot deck is one that does something with tarot you haven't seen before. It's creative in some new way, whether that's a totally different art style or a new theme or a different subject matter that you haven't seen before, um, or taking very classical Rider-Waite-Smith meanings, but then expressing them with symbols that you haven't seen used before. Right? There's a really lovely deck. I think this is the Tarot of the Abyss by Anatorian, where the Three of Swords shows like a woman who is sort of cracked like porcelain, and there's a missing piece in her heart. And like that's a really powerful, evocative image that made me take notice. So there are things like that that are, ways for a tarot deck to draw your attention and show that it can still do something new with tarot. But that is contingent upon a deck actually being a tarot deck. There's a certain point of creativity where you're doing new, fresh, and interesting things with a deck, but you deviate enough from sort of the standard tarot form that, to my mind at least, what you make no longer really constitutes a tarot deck. It's, a highly structured cartomantic oracle deck that may take some inspiration from tarot, but that is sort of its own internal system. Um, there are decks that are made, marketed, labeled, and sold as tarot decks that, to my mind, really aren't tarot. These would be things like the Motherpeace Tarot, the Dreams of Gaia Tarot, which are wonderful decks and really beautiful divinatory systems, but they have little enough in common with the traditional structure of tarot that when I look at them, I don't think, oh wow, that's a great tarot deck. I think, oh wow, that's a great oracle deck, or something like that. Um, and so I just wanted to talk about, like what qualifies as a tarot deck. What does something have to be in order to count as a tarot deck and not as some other kind of divinatory system? And real definitions are always tricky. As soon as you try to come up with a strict definition for tarot or anything else, you're going to find edge cases that test that definition. So we're not going to have a perfect definition here, but broadly speaking, the way that I think about tarot. Tarot is a 78 card divinatory deck with a particular structure to it. Some decks will have an additional card or two. So there are decks out there that have a happy squirrel card inspired by that one Simpsons episode. The Fountain Tarot has an extra card for the Fountain, which has some unique divinatory meaning that's explained in the Little White Book. Occasionally you will find 79 or 80 card decks, but at the very least, a tarot deck needs to have a certain set of 78 cards, and not so many more than 78 cards that those core 78 get lost in the wash, right? Like if you have a 100-card deck, it doesn't really feel like a tarot deck anymore. And truth be told, I don't read with the extra cards, right? When I use the Fountain Tarot, I pull out the Fountain card and I only read with the core 78. Generally speaking, I find that added 79th or 80th cards don't add much to my experience of reading with tarot. I've tried reading with them, but they don't do much for me. I'm a very stodgy traditionalist. That's just my taste. But so 78 cards divided into 5 suits, 22 major arcana, and then 56 minor arcana, which are in turn divided into 4 suits. And the 4 suits of the minor arcana correspond to the 4 elements of earth, air, water, and fire. Now, the particular naming of the suits or the symbols that are used to represent those elements can vary quite a lot from one tarot deck to another. So you can have the standard pentacles, swords, cups, and wands. You can have decks where the suits are just named earth, air, water, fire. Or you can have more creative decks where like the cups might be cauldrons, or the swords might be quills, or anything like that, right? You can have a lot of variation there, but at the very least you need the 4 suits and a correspondence between the suits and the elements. The suits, in turn, have to be divided ace through 10, and then 4 court cards, which once again represent sort of the 4 elements, earth, air, water, fire. And those court cards may be named the page, knight, queen, king, or some variation thereupon, or they may have entirely different naming conventions, right? Generally speaking, I think names in tarot get changed a lot and aren't rigid, aren't part of what something has to have as its core in order to count as a tarot deck. So, you might have like the Guardian or the Keeper or the Seeker, and these are names you'll find for the court cards if they're not using page, knight, queen, king, especially if they want to avoid gendered imagery, because the hierarchy of the court cards sort of is implicitly patriarchal, and that's something that a lot of deck creators want to avoid. That's the basic structure of the tarot deck, but that alone is not enough for something to feel sufficiently like tarot, because you can have a lot of variation within that structure, and enough variation to the point that it doesn't really count as tarot anymore. So if you have 22 major arcana, but the 22 major arcana aren't the same as the major arcana that you find in another tarot deck, right? If you don't have a card that corresponds to the Fool, and you don't have a card that corresponds to the Magician, and your 22 major arcana are like, the House, and the Lake, and so on. Those are very different symbolically and thematically from what you find in standard tarot. And just having 22 cards that you call the major arcana is not enough. Similarly, if the 8 of water in your tarot deck symbolically represents like wealth and material gain, that's very different from the meaning of the 8 of cups in the Rider-Waite system, where it talks about walking away from something or abandoning something. It's very different from the 8 of cups in the Thoth system, where it talks about indolence and stagnation. And it seems like that is not participating in the established structures of tarot. It seems like it's creating a new system altogether that has some superficial similarities with the structure of a tarot deck, but that really, to my mind at least, doesn't count as tarot. It counts as something unique and entirely its own. And so it seems like even though the names of things can vary quite a lot, you need a certain amount of thematic continuity, where the major arcana need to be numbered 0 through 21, and card 0 needs to deal with themes like potential, or creativity, or foolishness, or whatever, but like needs to deal with a range of themes that are pre-established as belonging to this particular tarot tradition. And different decks may take there are 3 main schools of tarot. You have the Tahoe de Marseille, you have the Rider-Waite-Smith, you have the Thoth, and there are variations in the themes across each of those decks. So like I said earlier, the 8 of Cups is very different in the Thoth system than in the Rider-Waite. But it seems to me that if you're making something that is to be a tarot deck, it's important to be drawing on at least one of those traditions in shaping the interpretations and the themes associated with each card in your deck. So if you're making an Eight of Water card for your deck, you want to draw on some of the themes that are established in tarot that came before you, regardless of whether you're drawing on Tarot de Marseille or Thoth or Rider-Waite-Smith. Um, and there are pretty established themes for each of the 78 cards in the major arcana, or in the tarot deck, 22 cards in the major arcana. You're going to have variation, certainly. Ask any 3 tarot readers what a given card means, you'll get 5 different answers, but the answers will all be in the same ballpark. They'll all be relatively similar or connected to each other in a way where each tarot reader can understand why the other interprets the card the way they do, right? You're all speaking the same language, you're just speaking different dialects of it. And that's the goal with a tarot deck, is that you want it to have this structure to it, but then the particular themes that fill in that structure want to feel like they belong to the same language of tarot. So, broadly speaking, particularly within the major arcana, you want 0 through 21, you want 0 to be roughly like the Fool, 1 to be roughly like the Magician, and so on down the line. Cards 8 and 11 swap in some decks, so sometimes 8 is Strength and 11 is Justice, sometimes 8 is Justice and 11 is Strength. Totally fine, but other than that switch, the order of the cards in the major arcana is fairly fixed, and the themes associated with each card, while flexible, belong in a certain ballpark, right? The Emperor is not going to be associated with, I don't know, romantic love. That's not a theme that we generally think of when we're talking about the Emperor, which is more a card of authority and power and ego. Um, and you want to stay true to that. And so when I'm coming back to the thing that started off the video, which is what makes a good tarot deck, when I'm thinking about what makes a good tarot deck, who am a very, like I say, a stodgy traditionalist when it comes to tarot, and I'm probably much more conservative with tarot than a lot of people are. So some people will have different opinions from me on this point, and that's totally okay. But when I'm looking at a tarot deck, what I'm looking for is something that really holds to that traditional tarot structure and the set of meanings for each card, and then artistically or visually, symbolically, or with some kind of a like thematic through line, like an Arthurian or a Cat's Tarot or something like that, plays with that structure and those themes in a way that is creative and new and engaging, that expresses the same structure of the deck and the same meanings of the cards in visually interesting ways that I haven't seen before. That's generally what I'm looking for in a tarot deck, and that's the kind of thing in a tarot deck that makes me sit up and take notice. There are other people who want much more deviation from tarot tradition than the kind of thing that tends to interest me, right? There are people who really want to like crack the tarot deck apart and say like, oh yeah, like what if we had 5 suits in the minor arcana? Or what if we totally jumbled up the order of the progression of the major arcana? And those are totally legitimate things to want to experiment with. Those make really interesting decks, and there are people who get a lot out of them. I own some decks like that, and quite like them. In my mind, I tend not to think of those as tarot decks, because my definition of tarot is more narrow. So when I'm thinking about looking for a cool tarot deck, I'm thinking within this very rigidly defined structure. And then thinking about decks that are more experimental, that do push the envelope, a lot of the time I'll appreciate those decks, I'll see the value in them, but I won't really think of them as tarot, and I'll sort of mentally class them as belonging to a category of more structured oracle decks. Um, yeah, I mean, what makes a good tarot deck is going to be different for everyone. But for me, where I come down on it is I want really rigid structure. I want well-defined, sort of established traditional meanings, and then within that, I want you to play and be creative and show me something I haven't seen before. And those are the decks that I tend to really, really appreciate. So some decks like this, just to sort of throw out a couple of examples, the Prisma Visions Tarot by James R. Eads is really visually stunning, and each set of suits in the Minor Arcana is associated with a particular season, and you can line them all up next to each other, and they tell a cohesive story from left to right, which I think is a really fun thing to do. The Fountain Tarot is just a really beautiful art style, and one that I consistently love and come back to. The Shadowscapes Tarot by Stephanie Puiman Law is a classic at this point, but when it came on the scene, it was really unique. There was nothing like it. Nothing had been like this before. And it's incredibly detailed, thoughtful art style. You can buy prints of her cards and you can blow them up, and there were just so many details, so many bits of symbolism built into the cards, and they tell these beautiful, beautiful stories. And those are the sorts of decks that really draw my attention and that make me think like, oh yeah, this is something new. This is a tarot deck unlike any other tarot deck I've seen before, and I want to play with this deck. I want to experiment with it and see where it takes me. So that's about all the rambling that I have for today. I'm going to tie it up here, but thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. Let me know down in the comments below what you think of as like the definition of a tarot deck, because that's something that really there is room for substantial debate about. But B, what do you look for when you're trying to think about what makes a good tarot deck? When you're faced with the glut of decks on the market and you're trying to figure out, is this a deck that I want? Is this a deck that I need to acquire? What makes a deck stand out for you? I'm genuinely curious because I think it's a highly variable thing and a highly personal thing. So, thank you so much and have a good day. I hope it's nice where you are as well. Bye.